We're here today to discuss the results of yesterday's presidential election in France. Emmanuel Macron has won the second and final round with 58.5% of the popular vote, and this makes him the first sitting French president to be re-elected in 20 years, and the first since de Gaulle to win while in control of the government. To make sense of what this result might mean for France and the wider European project, I'm delighted to be joined by our Paris Bureau Chief Sophie Pedder and a special guest, Benjamin Haddad from the Europe Centre at the Atlantic Council, and both of them are speaking to us from Paris. So welcome to you. Now, Sophie, let's start with your reaction. Macron's won by 58.5%, and in 2017 he won 66%. What do you make of the result, and what do you think are the most important consequences for France?
Well, I think the first point, Ed, to make is to grasp the historic nature of this vote. The French like to evict their leaders, and they have fine historic form in doing that. And I think that we have to remember that this is a president who's only 44 years old. He's only ever stood for office twice in his life, each time for the presidency and each time he's won. That is quite an achievement. So I think that the first thing we have to do is recognize that. Some of the polls, indeed, just before the runoff vote were suggesting he might get 56% of the vote at best, and he achieved over 58%. So that's also a pretty impressive result. Marine Le Pen, who was in the final against Emmanuel Macron, has achieved, she's never come this close to winning power. She achieved over 40% of the vote. That's significantly higher than in 2017 when she got 34% of the vote. And if you go back 20 years, and look at the score her father got in the second round runoff when he was there against Jacques Chirac in 2002. He only got 18%. So you can see a progression. You can see a strong vote for the extremes, for radicals, for populists, both on the left and the right, not just for Marine Le Pen, because don't forget that Jean-Luc Mélenchon also did very well. He narrowly missed getting into the second round. So I think we are looking at a very divided France, and that I think is the sort of second takeaway, that this is going to make governing France very difficult for Emmanuel Macron this time, because of the narrower vote and because of the way the country really feels very divided.
Thanks, Sophie. And Ben, if I could just turn to you now and ask what you think of the wider global implications of Macron's victory, and particularly for what he'll do in Europe. I mean, this leaves him now as the senior politician in Europe. How do you think he can make use of that position?
It does, and that's particularly important for Emmanuel Macron, who has put Europe and European sovereignty at the core of his political identity ever since he ran for office the first time in 2017. And as he said in the debate against Marine Le Pen, which I think was one of the reasons why the margin was so large yesterday, he said this election is a referendum on Europe. It's a referendum on French identity, French democracy. And of course, it's happening at a time where we have war back on the European continent with Ukraine, which played a central role, I think, in the campaign. Marine Le Pen was against sanctions, against weapons delivery to Ukraine, although she changed her tune somewhat in the last few weeks of the campaign. She was in favor of withdrawing from NATO military command to build an alliance with Russia. So we will see, I think, continued European and transatlantic unity and the support for Ukraine. I expect President Macron to travel very soon to Ukraine, maybe in the next few days. Who knows? Maybe he will bring Olaf Scholz with him. But at a time where Europeans are rearming, at a time where questions like energy independence, on which France is at the forefront, is at the center of the conversation, I think France will have, a critical role to play in the next 5 years with Mr. Macron. But for that, he still needs to focus in the next few weeks on domestic issues, as winning the parliamentary elections will be key. I think that his party is definitely the front runner for this election. The French traditionally tend to give a majority to the president that they elected, although a re-election is extremely rare. So we're in a sort of a different situation here. But if he wants to really govern domestically as well as on foreign policy, he will need to win those legislative elections in June.
Thanks. Well, I'll come to the detail of those legislative elections in a minute. Just before we do, I think it's worth looking back a little bit at the history of their campaign and on what it can tell us. Just to remind viewers that the French campaign happens in two stages. There was a first round when any candidates can stand, and 3 emerged over 20 in that. And then 2 weeks later, yesterday, there was this second round between just 2 candidates. So, Sophie, just taking the whole campaign, give us very briefly a sense of kind of what you derived from this campaign as compared with previous ones.
Well, if you compare it with 2017, I think it was, it was just a very different setup. Then you had Macron as this character who'd it felt like he'd come from nowhere. He created this party just a year before and took France by storm. In an extremely unexpected way, and there was a lot of energy. And if you went to his rallies in 2017, people were queuing down the pavement to try and come and listen to him speak. This campaign has been nothing like that. It's been extremely strange. We had at the end of last year, it was dominated by a very sort of insidious, toxic far-right discourse because of the candidacy of Eric Zemmour on the hard right, and that sort of dragged the whole debate for months onto pretty unpleasant territory and anti-immigration and sort of really unpleasant nationalistic kind of conversations that France would seem to be having with itself. And Emmanuel Macron waited so late to come into the campaign this year. He was doing a lot of diplomatic work, and therefore, he felt that he couldn't campaign while he was still trying to either stop Putin going to war in Ukraine or put an end to it. And therefore, you had a very short campaign where he was actually present. And there hasn't been that same fervor about. It's never going to be the same when you're an incumbent president and you're trying to defend a track record and you have, a lot of the country that doesn't like you. It didn't have the same feel. So I think, you end up with a very strange campaign at a time of war where the kind of level of excitement that was around in 2017 has been replaced with something much more close to sort of resignation, nervousness, and a sort of sense of uncertainty about where France is heading.
And Ben, one of the striking things about this was that at the end of the first round, the polls are really very close. I mean, the 2 leading candidates, Le Pen and Macron, were almost within the margin of error. And then in the 2 weeks after the first vote, the gap between them opened up until actually Macron won with a pretty handsome majority. What was going on in those 2 weeks? How do you explain that movement?
It's extremely interesting. As you said, just a couple of days before the first round, we could see polls tightening, both for the first round, but the second round polls as well, giving something like 51-49 for Macron, 52-48. He was always ahead, but it was clearly in the margin of error. And as people say here, the second round election, once you're past the first round, it's a completely different election. It's a completely different campaign. That's definitely what we saw. I think there were a few reasons for that. First, as Sophie just said, the first round campaign was very strange. Ukraine took center stage on TV. People were very worried and mobilized about this war. President Macron, who already planned, I think, to declare late in the process, had to do it even later because of his trip to Kiev and Moscow and his role as a mediator in the first couple of weeks of the war. And then Marine Le Pen benefited clearly from the fact that Zemmour protected her from a lot of exposure, from a lot of criticism. His campaign was really heavily publicized and central in the media. He's been a well-known journalist, polemicist, and writer from the far right for the last 15 years in France. People were very surprised to see him run for office. So it was a huge deal here. And I think a lot of the attacks were focused on him. And he helped Marine Le Pen escape a lot of the criticism and sort of detoxify her brand. He also took away a lot of her some of her lieutenants, including her own niece. So that gathered a lot of attention. So she ran, I think, a very underground campaign, focusing mostly on cost of living issues, focusing on her own image, on her cats. People, saying she moderated. What happened after the first round is she suddenly got back at the center of attention. And there was a little bit of a oh shit moment where people started reading her platform, really listening to what she was saying, and realized she was actually not that moderate. She had not detoxified her platform that much. If you looked at the fact that she wanted to ban the hijab in the streets, she was de facto proposing a Frexit, all but in name. If you looked at the different measures that she was proposing, either a complete paralysis of the European Union or a withdrawal of France down the road, that she was proposing an alliance with Russia. So I think people rediscovered the National Front, Marine Le Pen, and then Macron really got into the arena. I think he was criticized before the first round for not really getting involved in the campaign. And here again, he was campaigning every day. I think he focused a lot on trying to get some of the left-wing voters from Mélenchon focusing especially on green issues. He gave a big speech about the environment in Marseille. It is one area on which he's been criticized, not focusing enough of his effort and attention in his first term. So he already said that the prime minister will be in charge of the green transition in his second term. And then the debate happened. And I think at the debate, he was very effective at once again showing her own contradiction, showcasing her platform, why it doesn't work. And French debates are ruthless. It's 3 hours long. You can interrupt. You can speak to each other. It's not as controlled, I would say, as American presidential debates. So if after 3 hours, you lost it, everyone can see it. And I think that created the momentum that led him to 59%.
Well, obviously, we know that Le Pen's tried, I think, 3 times and got through to the second round twice. And we have a question from Curtis, who says, I'm from the USA, and when a candidate in the US loses twice, their chances of another try are very low. So what are the chances, Curtis asks, of Le Pen having another credible run in 5 years? Ben, I'll go to you first for a look at that. She tried to detoxify the party. Couldn't she do any more to do it?
Well, look, it's 5 years is a long way to go. She's going to be really contested. Zemmour is trying to contest her on her right. You'll see maybe new figures rising. No one knew about Macron 2 or 3 years before he ran for office the first time in 2017. So it's really a long way to go.
And Sophie, how do you see it? She's Le Pen's an adaptable politician and has done quite a lot to rebrand herself, but it clearly wasn't enough. Do you think she can do more?
I think, as Ben just said, 5 years is a really long time. And after her defeat in 2017, there was, she seemed to go into a bit of a depression, and there was some speculation about the fact that she might not even go back into politics at all. She might not pick herself up, but she did, and she came back, and she has run a pretty successful, by her standards, campaign. I would say that the thing to look out for over the coming months really is the possible recomposition on the right of the political spectrum. We've got an extraordinary situation where the legacy party on the centre right, the Republicans, has been crushed down to below 5%. Valérie Pécresse did put in her party's worst score ever in a presidential election under the Fifth Republic. And then you've got Marine Le Pen and Eric Zemmour having colonized this sort of hard right territory. But, parties are quite fluid in France, and there's going to be a lot of attempts, I think, to pull them all apart and kind of group them together. Already Zemmour's party is looking at ways of talking to Marine Le Pen's party to try and put together some kind of an alliance for the legislative elections in June. I think we could be looking at a period of a lot of volatility and a lot of fluidity between and among parties, even up and including the sort of nationalistic wing of the Republican Party. So I wouldn't say that either the sort of hard right proposition or Marine Le Pen are sort of over yet.
If I can add something, because I think on the two visions of Zemmour and Marine Le Pen, it's a very interesting debate because Zemmour is not so much a populist. He is a traditional far-right nationalist that's really rooted in an anti-Republican, anti-liberal tradition going back to the turn of the century, the 1930s. He often quotes monarchist intellectuals, and his objective is really to do the alliance of the right, the moderate right, the Republicans, and the far-right nationalist right. Marine Le Pen has had a different strategy. Marine Le Pen was really hoping to get the Mélenchon votes. So she was hoping to have the populist right and the populist left converge mostly on a social-economic platform, on protectionism, anti-European cost of living issues. So these are two quite different directions that the far right could take, the more populist and the more nationalist. Of course, there's a lot of overlap, and so there is room for an alliance, but it's really two different intellectual projects that it will be interesting to see which direction it takes in the next few years.
That is really interesting, and it's particularly thrown into the relief by the fact that so few young people voted for Macron. We have a question from Thomas, who says, why did fewer young people vote for Macron at this election compared with 2017? And I put that in the context of what you both said, which is, it's really unclear to me, what is the nature of the opposition to Macron at this point? And do young people sort of point the way forward in this? Sophie, let's start with you on that one.
Well, I think the first point to make is that the 18 to 24-year-olds, they 2/3 of them voted for Macron. So I think one has to kind of get that in perspective. It's this was not a popular vote for a majority vote for Marine Le Pen in that age category. The young vote, actually, a lot of it went to Mélenchon in the first round. And I think one of the things to remember about this vote is that Mélenchon managed to sort of, he benefited from a tactical voting. He brought in or drew to him all sorts of voters who might not have really believed in either him or his program. He also had a pretty extreme position, wanting to pull out, like Marine Le Pen, pull France out of NATO's integrated military command, for example. And he managed to emerge as the figure who had the greatest chance of keeping Marine Le Pen out of that second round. And he really narrowly missed doing that. So in doing so, drew voters from the Green Party, voters from the Socialist Party, voters from, across the sort of other bits of the left-wing spectrum. And many of those were young voters. So I think one has to just be careful about saying that, Macron hadn't got the vote at all, or that Marine Le Pen, the young vote, or that Marine Le Pen did. The young vote was scattered. Having said that, what's absolutely clear is that young people didn't turn out to vote in the numbers that they could have or should have, perhaps, in the second round. We had abstention rates of nearly 40% among young voters, and that obviously is a really worrying sign of sort of disengagement with the electoral process, with possibly the whole concept of representative democracy in some respects. I think young people seem to find that it doesn't speak to them in the way that it does for older people. So I think there is a lot of work that Macron has there to reconnect and think about what form of democracy France takes. There's always debates about changing the constitution, maybe introducing proportional representation, maybe having a more consultative form of democracy with more referendums. These are sort of endless debates, and Macron's raised some of these questions in the past, but I think he does have some thinking there to do about how to re-engage young people with the democratic process.
And Ben, if I can pose that question to you in a slightly different way, which is, it's interesting that young people who wanted to vote for the left didn't vote for the socialists, the centre-left party. They went right out to the hard left with Mélenchon. What does that tell you?
A couple things. First, it does confirm the intuition that Macron had in 2016, 2017, where he created his En Marche platform, which is that basically the way the debate was structured did not correspond to how people thought about their own political identities. If you looked at the traditional socialist and Republican party, the center left and the center right, which had governed France for the better part of the last half century, they were bitterly divided over issues that were central, especially with relations to the European Union, to the question of economic reform, on the question of French identity. Sometimes, if you were a right person, you had much more in common with moderates of the left, like Manuel Valls, or like what someone like Dominic Strauss-Kahn, who was a sort of social democrat, than you had with people in your own party who could be social conservative, could be Eurosceptic. And I think that's something that Macron felt, is that as the National Front was really emerging as this illiberal, anti-European force, and was de facto the first political force in France in the years 2015, 2016. She was poised to get first in the first round. If he hadn't created En Marche, he needed to create sort of a political alternative. So this has led, I think, to the collapse of the Socialist Party and the Republican Party, which have, one of the big striking facts of the first round was to see Valérie Pécresse, the Republican candidate who started the campaign as a serious contender for the presidency and ended up below 5%. I mean, this was Sarkozy's party, this was Jacques Chirac's party, which came in fifth in the first round. So I think these parties have just not been able to adapt, have not been able to give really a strong political offer to the French that really corresponded to the major issues. And I think another point is that we see this in all of our democracies. We see the rise of Bernie Sanders on the left and the Trumpists on the right in the United States. There is, I think, a desire of radicality. There's a desire for authenticity that these politicians are able to espouse. And to go back quickly on the question of young people, I completely agree with Sophie on the 18 to 24. They voted overwhelmingly for Emmanuel Macron against Marine Le Pen, although a lot of them abstained, of course. What's really striking is to see the hold that the far right has on the next category, which is the 25 to 34. And I think that's a very typically French problem that you don't necessarily see in other countries like the United States or the UK, that I suspect is largely linked to the rigidity still, even though we've made a lot of progress in the last few years, of the labor market in France, of the fact that it's a very insider system that's very hard to penetrate for someone who just graduated or someone who didn't go to the right schools. It's a very closed off system. And I think these years are particularly tough for French people of every walks of lives, and which leads them, I think, to a sort of anti-system solution. And that's definitely a challenge that Emmanuel Macron will have to answer in the next few years.
Thank you, Ben. Well, let's dig a little bit deeper into results now. Our election model, with the time of the end of the first round, gave Marine Le Pen a 25% chance of winning at one point. And that means that if you ran the election 4 times, she would have run one of those times. By the end, it was just a 6%, a 5% chance of winning, which means if you ran the election 20 times, she'd run one of them. And I want now to look at a map of France that shows how that sort of 1 in 20 chance mapped out across the country. And Sophie, I wonder if you could just talk through the geography of that map. Why are things clustered as they are, and what does it tell you about the pattern of voting across France for these two candidates?
Yes, of course, and it's a really good map. It tells you a lot, I think, about the geography of voting in France. You have a couple of things going on here. You have what's sort of thought of as happy France, and that's the western side of France, Brittany, and all the way down to the southwest, which is where Macron does better than the sort of northeast industrial parts of the country up near the Belgian border, and then in the east in Alsace, as well as the southern fringe, which has a history of voting on the far right, where Le Pen has done really well. But if you look at in even greater detail, you'll see that if the big cities, you can see Paris is indicated, but there are other big cities as well, Bordeaux down there on the southwest corner, and Lyon, Marseille, even Lille in the north. You can see intense red areas. These are sort of thriving cities that are doing really well, and they are absolutely Macron supporting. If you take Paris, he got 85% of the second round vote. If you take Lyon, he got 78% of the second round vote. These are real sort of Macron voting big cities. But then you move out to those rural areas, and when you say rural, it's not just rural as in sort of farmland. It's rural, but semi-rural. People living in areas that are very dependent on their cars. They are shopping probably in hypermarkets. They're probably traveling to work by car. They might be working in low-paid jobs and probably in service sector. And those people living in rural areas, but perhaps working in nearby small towns, those people voted for Marine Le Pen, and that is where she spent her campaign. It was fascinating to be on the campaign trail with her. You know, I spent a day in Pertuis, which is a village in Provence, rather beautiful village. And she is on the market, shaking people's hands, having selfies with people. This is where she focused her campaign. She was talking about cost of living, the sort of, sympathizing with their struggle to make ends meet, sympathizing with the fact that they have to take their car out, and they were fed up with being told that using your car was, sort of anti-environmental. And I think that's where you really saw the division between a sort of geographical, the two sides of France in a very fractured way, and that was exploited very cleverly by Marine Le Pen, certainly in the run-up to that first round vote.
And when we were talking this morning, Sophie, you said to me that there'd been a kind of feeling among these people that somehow this vote wasn't legitimate, and that Macron wasn't the legitimate president of France. And from outside, that seems kind of really hard to understand. So in what sense is he thought not to be legitimate?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to be clear what we're saying here. I mean, Marine Le Pen conceded. She is not contesting the legitimacy of this election. And in that sense, she has accepted the democratic process. This is not a Trump-like situation. However, the argument that is out there, and it's, it has to be listened to, even if it's a spurious one, is that because abstention rate was the turnout rate was 72%. So you had 28% abstention. This was higher than it's been for a very long time in France. You have to go back decades to find as low an abstention rate. It may not be that low by international standards. I think that's important to recall that actually even at 72% participation, it's higher than in the US, it's higher than in local, in recent national elections in the UK as well. But it is for France considered low. And therefore, if you take Macron's result, his 58.5%, as a percentage of all those on the electoral roll, you end up with a 38% of those who are registered to vote voting for Macron. And this is where the legitimacy argument comes in. Now, I mean, you've got a real problem with that, because if you're looking for that, no president under the Fifth Republic except Jacques Chirac ever got over 50% of the those on the electoral register. So under that argument, almost every single president has always been illegitimate. But it's the sort of, it's on the basis of that those who are feeling angry and frustrated and disillusioned by this result that are making that kind of a claim.
And Ben, do you think that this is going to in any way sort of hang over Macron? How does it express itself in protests on the streets or what?
Well, there's a few questions. I mean, first, right now, you have basically three blocks in the country. If you look at the voting pattern, you have Macron, which is the central block. You have Mélenchon, the far left, and Marine Le Pen on the far right. So they're going to face off in the parliamentary elections. I think the most likely, unless something big happens in the next 6 weeks, is that Macron will have a parliamentary majority, as is already the case today. But then it does pose, I think, a democratic question. I agree with Sophie. I mean, if you look at turnout and if you look at the score yesterday, this is an overwhelming win for the French president, especially for a re-election where you never have the same level of energy and enthusiasm that you have in the first term. But when you compare it to the United States, to the UK, to a lot of the countries around us, this is still a very strong mandate. But he is, a lot of the opponents are trying to use this and use these figures, especially the relatively low turnout when you compare it to recent French history, to say that he's not legitimate. The problem for me is that the way our institutions are set up is that you don't have many, especially if the president has the parliamentary majority, you don't have checks and balances, counterpowers within the system that can take in that anger, or that can take in the concerns and frustrations of people who did not vote for him. Local officials have power than they do in Germany or in the United States. You don't have a culture of negotiation with the opposition in parliament like you would have in a country like the US. And so this is why you end up with a culture of protest taking the streets, which of course is part of French tradition, and foreigners like to poke fun at us for it. But it's also a very rational response to a system that is so centralized around the person of the president that if you want to convey a message, if you want to protest, if you want your concerns to be heard, it's actually one of your most rational recourse is to take the street and sort of establish a balance of power directly with the president. And now one quick word on the map that we saw. Sophie really underscored the contrast between urban France and rural France. It's something that we saw with the Gilets jaunes. And the Gilets jaunes, I think the yellow jackets were a direct response to the fact that a part of the French population does not feel represented right now in the French elite and the French political system. I'll just give you one anecdote that I think is really striking. At the end of Macron's first term in 2017, there was a poll that asked the French, what do you think is Macron's most symbolic measure? And I think a lot of us in think tanks and media in Paris would have talked about European issues, maybe would have talked about reforms to the labor market or reducing taxes. But for the first measure that was mentioned by the French is the reduction of speed limitations from 90 to 80 kilometers an hour. And that's something when you live in Paris and you barely drive, and a lot of people don't even have either a driver's license or a car. That's something that was no one thought about it, but that was a key driver of the yellow jacket movement. Is the cost of fuel, the fact that bringing the speed limitation to 80 kilometers an hour made it longer for them to go to work in the morning, to drop their kids at school. These are people who drive every day. So just even in relationship to your car, there's a huge, I think, dividing line in the country that you can see also in these electoral maps.
Well, both of you have mentioned the legislative elections, and they're coming up in June. Just, I wonder if Sophie, you could explain to us kind of what's at stake there. If I'm thinking of what Macron might be able to achieve in the next 5 years when he does have a majority in the assembly compared with if he doesn't have a majority, what difference does that make, do you think?
Well, it makes a big difference. I mean, in terms of just pushing through legislation, if he's governing with either in a coalition or if there is another party that ends up winning a majority, it's extremely unlikely, I think. But the scenario, I guess, is out there. It would make life extremely difficult. He would be relegated to running political affairs, abroad, foreign affairs, diplomacy. But he wouldn't be able to pursue his own agenda. I just don't think that's a likely scenario. I mean, we've got. There is a tradition. I think Ben mentioned this earlier, that in the legislative election, the French tend to vote the same way that they have in the presidential election, since the term was reduced from 7 years to 5, the presidential term, I mean, because that has put the two elections in sync with each other. But, this is a very volatile time. I don't think it's absolutely guaranteed that Macron will get his majority. He certainly is unlikely to get it with his own party, but he governs currently with a sort of group of parties known as the presidential majority, and that includes Modem, the party that belongs led by François Bayrou. It includes other sort of micro parties, and so there is I think a good possibility or probability even that some kind of a grouping of these centrist or allied parties, including the party that Edouard Philippe, his former prime minister, who's a Republican, used to be a Republican, that he set up, could give them another presidential majority. I think that's most likely. But I think the really interesting thing to look for is the score that Mélenchon manages to get in the legislatives. At the moment, his party, La France Insoumise, has got a very I think they're on 17 deputies in the House out of 577. That's really small. But on the back of a very good showing at the presidential election, if he can find some sort of way of doing alliances or informal arrangements with some of the other parties on the left, he could be looking at winning in a much bigger block, and then I think it would be a sort of a party of nuisance and obstruction in the assembly, rather than a presence that was able to absolutely stop legislation going through. But it would make life a lot more complicated for Macron.
Thank you. I'd like to look ahead then now at sort of what this election means for the next 5 years in France. And it's quite noticeable in his acceptance speech that Macron talked about bringing the country together. And in fact, when other candidates, when Marine Le Pen's name was mentioned and there was booing in the crowd, he told people to quieten down. And he made it very clear that he wants to govern for all the French. Well, Ben, I'd ask you whether you thought that was just boilerplate political rhetoric, or whether he really intends to govern for all the French. And if he does, what would that actually mean?
First, on the booing and whistling, it's been actually a trademark of Macron and his rallies ever since he launched En Marche. Always try to be positive and not attack, or at least not boo individuals. He will have to try to, I think, broaden his base. He was pretty successful initially at bringing the center left and the center right. I think that with the shift to the right of a big chunk of the French electorate, especially on issues of identity and security, you have seen this also in the way his cabinet was structured. So I wouldn't be surprised that in the announcements he makes on prime minister or on the key ministries, you see some figures coming more from the left, especially on green issues, which I think will be really central in the way he names figures. I think the big question mark is, how does he appeal to the France that voted for Marine Le Pen? And obviously he can't do this just by cherry picking individuals. I think he will have to listen to the concerns over cost of living, over the geographical fracture that we've seen really at the core of the Yellow Jacket movement. Try to make the country. This is the reason why I think it's very difficult. It's a huge challenge that goes way beyond Macron. Is that this is the way our country is structured. It's extremely centralized around Paris. You do have this major discrepancy between big urban areas, and especially Paris, and rural areas. And so, this will have to go through a major overhaul of our social services, of our relationship to education, to the economy. So I think you have some pretty steep challenges ahead, because, he can only run for president twice. We've seen Marine Le Pen increase her share of the voting, and I think she's still suffering from the toxicity of her last name that is still, I think, divisive in France. So there is a real risk that a Eurosceptic populist with a different kind of image, more polished maybe than hers, and maybe stronger on substance, in 5 years could win the election. And I think that's something that will be part of his legacy for sure.
And Sophie, our viewer Trevor asks, how will the different geographical areas and dispositions be reconciled by Macron?
It's very difficult. I think one of the greatest challenges, and the Gilets jaunes protest really brought that out, is how do you embrace a really strong green policy while not aggravating those who depend on their cars. And in a way, and those who depend on their cars, I mean people who don't have the budgets to buy themselves an electric car, and they need to fill up their tank every single week. And I think that this is the sort of, it's that kind of a policy dilemma that is at the heart of what Macron's going to have to do. If Ben's just mentioned the fact that at a rally in Marseille, on the last Saturday, the Easter weekend, where I was there, and Macron promised to make the environment and the green transition at the heart of everything he does, and he said that this is an absolute sort of priority. Now, part of that was to attract the youth vote, which is very much more green-minded than perhaps the older vote is. But if he's serious about doing that, he's going to have to deal with that contradiction, and I think that is where we will really be able to test whether he can talk to people, speak to people, understand what it is that makes them feel so resistant when they hear, people who live near metro stations and ride their bicycle to work, saying, "Well, you just need to, get on your bicycle too." This just makes absolutely no sense and makes people very angry who are living in rural areas. So I think, the one subject that has got to work and has got to work for people in that area, in those sort of areas, is going to be how he deals with the contradictions of environmental policy and dependence on the car.
And this is partly a question about the sort of politician he's become. And you've written very interestingly about, how 5 years of power has changed Macron. You went down with him to Marseille for, I think it was 3 days, and followed him around and saw him dealing with people who are certainly not his natural constituency. How do you feel a second-term Macron will approach these problems that require human touch as well as a policy brain?
I think that's right, Ed. I mean, it's fascinating to think back to the sort of concept that Macron, I think, went into the presidency with about how power should be exercised in France. You have this very grand presidency. You occupy a palace. You have these extraordinary powers. People think of you as much more than just an elected leader. They want you to represent the country. And Macron had this what was known as a Jupiterian approach to being president, and he wanted to step back and remain a remote figure in some respects to embody that sort of grandeur. And this, in a way, did meet an aspiration that the French have for their president, but I think it also created a bit of a trap for him. And one of the things that was very striking for me when I was reporting that profile of him that you just mentioned was that, if you, as I did, follow him into a meeting on a community organization, in a housing project in a very rundown part of Marseille, and there he is squashed on a sofa talking to community organizers. And he has a very good one-on-one conversation with them. He listens, he has a very good rapport. They're all astonished because they see this sort of grand figure, this remote figure, and then that's not what they're expecting. That's not who walks into this sort of community center. And I think that his difficulty has been to project that empathy that he shows in private into the public domain. He has real difficulty doing that. And if he's going to find some way of coming across as a more sort of human leader, a human face of the French presidency for the second term, I think he's going to have to work on that to somehow try and bridge that gap, because a lot of the people that I've met out during the reporting for this campaign, that is what irritates them most about Macron, is that they feel he doesn't understand them, he can't connect to them. So I think you're right that the tone and the measure of respect he shows for people is really going to be a key to making sure that he can bring the country behind him.
And Ben, you mentioned a bit earlier that, in a way he's liberated now. He can't stand again, so he doesn't face re-election. Once the June legislative elections are past him, he's free, isn't he, to govern perhaps in a slightly different way. We have a question from David on that, which says, what are the two major measures Macron needs to achieve internally in France, and will he be able to finance it? So I just add to that, will he be freer to follow those kinds of things now he doesn't have to face re-election?
Yeah, well, there are obviously upsides and downsides to it. One is that he is freer, and so I think he will continue his agenda of reforming the French economy, raising the pension age and overhauling the pension system is high on the agenda, as well as modernizing the French state, the French civil service. He's tried to open it up to make it possible to bring more breathing and fluidity in the system so that people could go work in the private sector and back into the public sector. I think Europe and international issues, but really his agenda of European sovereignty will be extremely high on the agenda, especially as, if we get closer to the second part of this term, of course, there will be questions about whether he's a lame duck. You will start seeing some ambitions in his own party for running for president. He's very aware of this, of course, and that's actually going to be one of the questions in how he builds his own government and the kind of alliances that he builds in the parliamentary elections next month. But I think Europe is so central to how he thinks about politics that I think pushing forward a European agenda on questions like European defense, for example, will be very high. And to go back to Sophie's point, it's so interesting to look at the way he's evolved and he's governed in the last 5 years, because he does have a reputation for being aloof and sometimes distant, that I think is really belied by the way he behaves when he is in front of people. He's a very good campaigner, and people are always really surprised at how engaged he is and how long he stays in individual conversation when he's on the ground. I think he was trying at the beginning of his presidency to not fall into some of the trappings of his predecessor, François Hollande, who tried to be, quote, a normal president, and I think lost a lot of the gravitas that French people expect from the presidency. So you have to strike that balance between finding the gravitas, not speaking to reporters or being on TV every 5 minutes, which is a little bit of what Hollande was doing, but at the same time still being accessible and getting into the political arena, not staying just in your palace. That's the way he ended, for example, the Yellow Jackets. He started this big national debate where you could see him going from town to town in France, listening to people, interacting with them, some town hall meetings basically for 7-8 hours in a row, often until 1 or 2 a.m. And people were glad they could exchange with. I was with him just 3 weeks ago on a campaign stop on the market, and an anti-vax woman went to talk to him, and he stayed close to 15 minutes chatting with her. At some point, she said, "Mr. President, I know you're very busy, so I don't want to take too much of your time." He said, No, but we're not done. And he just kept on going and talking, trying to convince her. It was pretty striking. So I think he needs to find that right balance between being engaged, talking to people, which is hard when you're president, while at the same time, of course, governing and keeping with that gravitas that the French expect from the president in a very almost monarchical system.
Thank you, Ben. And Sophie, I'd like to ask you David's question as well. What are the two major measures that you think Macron needs to achieve in France?
Well, I think for his own credibility, he's going to have to get back to pension reform. This is one of the flagship reforms he tried to get through on his first term in office. He had to shelve it because of the pandemic, but he was planning to merge all of France's pension regimes, which are all sort of incomprehensible to most people when they look at trying to work out what their pension rights are, and at the same time raise the retirement age. At that point, it was from 62 to 64. Now, he's now promised to raise that to 65. The French are living longer. It's a system that is financed under, as you go. In other words, the young working today pay for their elders in retirement today as well, and so it puts a lot of strain on those in work. And I think he has to show that he has got, if he's going to remain a sort of reformist president, which he was more or less in his first term in office, I think he's got to do that. And I suppose the second one really is the same as Ben. It's about Europe. It's about, he will become one of the most experienced leaders in Europe. It's amazing to think, he's only 44, but he is now becoming one of those with more experience. France still holds the rotating presidency of the European Union Council, and that goes on until June. And I think there is an expectation that he will, perhaps be a more consultative and perhaps alliance building sort of French president this time round, that he's learned that he can't just sort of march in and expect everyone to follow in line behind him. He, I think, will be more conscious that he needs to work with others to sort of build those kind of alliances. So I think I will be watching for how he engages, not just what he's trying to do with the European Union, but how he engages other European capitals and other European leaders in trying to form a consensus behind some of the things he's putting in place or wants to.
Yes, thanks. Well, Gary asked exactly that question, and I'll put this to you, Ben. Gary says, do you believe that France can actually assume the role of European leader, or do you think that Germany will once again emerge as the leader?
No, I think there's a great window of opportunity for France to play a key role. He is experienced. I think a lot of the issues related to question of defense, question of energy independence, of the general rearmament of Europe, are issues that France has been pushing forward for the last 5 years and even more. And so I think France can intellectually and politically, with Macron, play a key role in Europe. I think the key, and with Merkel leaving the stage and Scholz having a little bit of an awkward start as chancellor in Europe, I think there's a role that France can play. He has learned. I think what Sophie said about the method is really key. In the first couple of years of his first term, there was a very strong emphasis on the relationship with Germany. I would say even the personal relationship with Angela Merkel and this Franco-German engine that was seen as the driver of Europe. I think more emphasis has been put in the second part of the term successfully. So in engaging other partners that had been often overlooked. You have a very good relationship with Prime Minister Draghi of Italy, with Prime Minister Mitsotakis of Greece, new partnerships with Central Eastern European countries. France is sending troops within NATO to Romania. So I think a key challenge in this sort of method is how does he manage to build coalitions, more flexible coalitions with different kinds of partners, including in areas like Central Europe, where France has often overlooked, has not been very engaged. Relations have been fraught with misunderstanding, I would say mistranslations also of issues like strategic autonomy. So that will really be key, I think, to his success in Europe in the next 5 years.
Thank you. And Sophie, lots of viewers, including Karen, are asking how Macron's victory will affect the war in Ukraine.
Well, I think I would turn that round and I would say, how would things change had Marine Le Pen been elected president? I mean, one of the things that really damaged her, I think, in the second round debate was the way in which Macron went for her sympathy for Putin. She had originally printed a manifesto brochure which showed her smiling, shaking hands with Putin, and she has, campaign finance. Even today, she's paying outstanding loan off, which was contracted with a Russian bank back in 2014. So, I mean, the sympathy that she had for Putin, I think, was raising in France among a lot of people who were thinking about their votes very, very serious questions about what sort of foreign policy in Europe and towards Russia a Le Pen president would have. Now, Macron is, I don't think he's going to change his line, which has always been that he likes to maintain a dialogue with Putin. It's controversial outside France, but I think inside France, it's generally understood that this is a way in which it is important to be able to pass messages, to make sure that Putin hears things that he might not want to hear, and it doesn't exclude France also maintaining a very strong role in terms of imposing sanctions on Russia and in terms of deterrence. As Ben just mentioned, France, since the war began, has increased its deployment. Well, actually, not just increased, it's sent troops to Romania as part of the NATO force there. So I think you'll see more of the same, more of an attempt for France to have an open door to trying to be the power that could possibly bring about some form of negotiated settlement if that ever comes, but not at any cost. And certainly Macron, since in the last few weeks, hasn't had direct contact with Putin at all. So I think that it's likely to be continuity more than anything else of the policy that he has pursued up till now.
Sophie, I remember when we went to interview Macron, and he used that phrase that NATO is experiencing brain death, that sort of somehow really sunk in. So Catherine asks, in that spirit, what does this election mean for NATO?
I mean, it's very interesting, what Macron says about NATO these days and what he said to us that time in November 2019, Ed. I think that because of that phrase, which went round the world and horrified a lot of members of the Transatlantic Alliance, and they said so at the time, because of that, he is associated with some sort of a kind of anti-NATO policy, or as if he's been trying with his efforts to build up European defence, as if this is a kind of challenge to NATO or an attempt to undermine it in some way. Now, what's interesting to me is however many times since then he's said, actually, I'm hoping to build up European collective defence as a pillar of NATO and as a way of reinforcing it. The skeptics, I think, still don't quite believe that that's the case because of the phrase that he used in that interview. I think what he was wanting to do, in retrospect, was to get people to think hard about, how allies coordinate within the Transatlantic Alliance, and that had been particularly difficult at the time because of the tensions between the US and Turkey, for example. But I think if you look back, that for me, one of the key achievements that Macron has made in trying to persuade people that the two are not contradictory, that he does actually support NATO. Well, one of them was the fact that he has, since the war, in Putin's war against Ukraine, he has sent this contingent to Romania under NATO banner. France also has contingents in Estonia as part of NATO operations there. But also, I think a key concession that he obtained was from Joe Biden. And this was at the G7 summit in Rome last October, when the Americans and French jointly issued a statement saying, and so therefore with the explicit backing of the US, that this was that the US acknowledged, or both countries acknowledged, that efforts to strengthen European defense is an effort to strengthen NATO too. So I think that he has evolved, and he's probably evolved further than the perception of him has.
And Ben, if I could ask you about what you think is going to be Macron's relations with the United States and Biden in the first place, and then sort of tack onto that a question from Po Wun, who says, what can we expect of the relationship between France and China? So here it is, thinking about the EU between the world's two biggest powers.
Yeah. So on China, it's very clear to me that building up the European Union as a power that can defend its trade interests, its sovereignty on issues from the environment to technology, will be at the core of the way he's going to deal with China. And that was already the case, I think, in the last 5 years. He's always been actually very successful at Europeanizing his China policy, much more so than his Russia policy, where a lot of his critics in Europe, especially in the first couple of years of his term, have pointed to the fact that he was leading this sort of unilateral dialogue with Putin, not really bringing in his partners like he did in the dialogue with Beijing. I think in the United States, I mean, he has a good relationship with President Biden. Of course, we had a rocky year last year with AUKUS, but there's a lot of converging interest and views on global issues between the two of them. But as we just said, I think his agenda on European defense and strategic autonomy will still be very high for him, and it's in no way contradictory with having France play a key role within NATO. I think he's always said that, on the contrary, giving Europeans the ability to defend their interest and their security on their own, if necessary, especially in their own neighborhood, the Middle East, in areas where the United States wants to withdraw, and regardless of what's happening with Ukraine, is not only a necessity for Europe, but would be a key asset for NATO and for the United States. I think we have a window of opportunity to do it with Europeans taking security issues much more seriously since the beginning of this war. The trend towards increased defense spending all over the continent, and the dialogue that's been started between the United States and France post-AUKUS on the role that European defense can play. So I think that's a conversation also that Americans should welcome, and I hope that France will engage the U.S. more on this European and transatlantic debate.
So we're almost out of time, but I think I've got just squeeze one last question in, and it shows that our viewers definitely look forward because they're already asking about the 2027 election. A lot of them want to know who might follow Macron. So Chao Wen says, is there a successor apparent for Macron or indeed for Le Pen? So this is real time for getting out your crystal balls. I'll start with you, Sophie. Who do you look ahead to?
I think what's interesting about the way Macron exercises power is that it's extremely centered around himself, and he does not have a good track record of sort of nurturing figures, or at least when he does, he doesn't keep them for very long, as we saw with Edouard Philippe, who is prime minister, who was replaced. I mean, I think that this is a challenge for him, and it would be very interesting to see if he does actually engage in a kind of strategy of nurturing a figure. Interestingly, with Edouard Philippe, by the way, you know, he also has a knack of picking people who no one's ever heard of, putting them in the prime minister's office, and then they suddenly become, you know, potential successors to Macron. So I think that you know, we may not yet have seen emerge the name of the person who might become the sort of that potential inheritor. But I think, given the personal way he exercises power, it's not a natural thing for Macron to do. So it is a real challenge for him. For Le Pen, you know, it's I think all eyes are always on her niece, Marion Maréchal, she defected from Marine Le Pen's party to Eric Zemmour, and there is a sort of a real, she's very young, she is very ambitious, and I think you're looking at someone who is not necessarily going to inherit Marine Le Pen's party, but could inherit a sort of position that Ben was talking about earlier, which is to say uniting the sort of nationalist right within the Republican Party and the nationalist right within Zemmour's movement, and that's something that she could possibly do.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And Ben, very briefly from you, a couple of names of people who might succeed Macron and Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, so way too early to tell, but a couple of names. I mean, Edouard Philippe, his former prime minister, is very popular today, but it's still a long way to go in 5 years. I think we probably don't know yet the person who will succeed. And who knows, we can have surprises. We have a very talented French woman who lives in Frankfurt right now who could decide to come back at some point. It could be someone from French politics. And I think on the far right, it's very open. But having an outsider like Zemmour, another one, maybe, you know, Cyril Hanouna, who is a sort of populist TV show host, very popular, who knows. So I think it's open and we'll have surprises. And it'll also be, last point, it'll be very interesting to see what a 49-year-old former president decides to do with his life. That will also be an interesting question.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to find out more about our upcoming subscriber events, please click the link. On the same page, you can also find recordings of previous events, including a great roundup of technologies to watch this year. See you next time.